Wake Island wasn't much, at least not in the eyes of most who first laid eyes on it. Just a speck in the vast blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean, the island sat roughly 2,300 miles west of Hawaii, 1,500 miles east of Guam, and nearly 2,000 miles southeast of Tokyo. To passing ships and high-flying aircraft, it looked like nothing more than a comma-shaped atoll of coral and sand. It had no lush jungles like Guadalcanal, no mountains or rivers like Oahu, only 3 narrow islets forming a ragged horseshoe around a shallow turquoise lagoon. But its unimpressive size masked its immense strategic value. For the United States, especially in the tense months of 1941, Wake Island was far more than just a tropical outpost. It was a critical stepping stone in the Pacific chessboard. With Japanese expansion sweeping through East Asia and tensions escalating throughout the Pacific, military planners in Washington understood the island's potential importance as a forward base. Its location made it an ideal midpoint between Midway and Guam, and from it, American air power could theoretically reach deep into the Western Pacific. By October of 1941, construction crews had begun transforming Wake's barren shores into a functioning airbase, port, and garrison, though not without difficulty. Wake had no natural freshwater source, no roads, no indigenous population, and no vegetation beyond salt-tolerant scrub. Everything had to be shipped in, assembled, and maintained under grueling conditions of heat, salt spray, and relentless isolation. Into this environment came the U.S. Marines, just under 450 of them, under the command of Major James P.S. Devereux. These men, hardened by training and bound by discipline, represented the core of Wake's defensive force. They brought with them grit, courage, and a small arsenal of dated yet functional weaponry. Their heavy guns consisted of 6 5-inch 51 caliber naval guns salvaged from decommissioned World War I-era battleships. These were mounted in concrete emplacements at key points around the atoll and were to be the main line of resistance against any sea-based threat. For air defense, the Marines depended on just 12 Grumman F-4, F-3 Wildcat fighters from Marine Fighter Squadron V, MF-211. Sleek and sturdy, these carrier-based fighters were capable machines, but even at full strength, the squadron was barely enough to cover such a wide perimeter. Worse yet, the aircraft had only recently arrived, flown in from the USS Enterprise in late November, and many of the pilots were still familiarizing themselves with the terrain and flight conditions around the island. Joining the Marines were nearly 1,200 civilian contractors, most of them employees of the Morrison-Knudsen Company. These workers, carpenters, electricians, surveyors, crane operators, had been hired to complete the airstrip, install defenses, and build up barracks and living quarters. They lived in temporary housing, labored under scorching sun and sudden squalls, and often felt more like an army of forgotten laborers than part of any war effort. Yet their work was vital. Wake's airfield was not just a military installation, it was a lifeline for future operations. It would support long-range reconnaissance, bomber refueling, and possibly serve as a refit station for submarines and patrol aircraft. Without it, American mobility in the Pacific would be severely hindered. Still, morale on the island varied. Many Marines, accustomed to strict discipline and stoic routines, treated Wake like any other post, a place to guard, train, and wait. The civilian contractors, on the other hand, often found the situation boring and frustrating. There was little to do after work hours, no amenities to speak of, and the ever-present humidity corroded equipment and tempers alike. A sense of isolation hung over the island like a low mist, made worse by spotty radio communications and the vast emptiness beyond the reef. It felt like the edge of the world. Despite the monotony, preparations continued. Trenches were dug across likely landing zones. Coastal guns were zeroed in. Pilots flew daily patrols, often chasing shadows in the endless blue. Ammunition was stockpiled in sandbagged bunkers. Machine gun emplacements were fortified with whatever material could be found. Still, the Marines knew they were short on everything: aircraft parts, spare munitions, radar, even fresh water. Their tiny force seemed ill-suited to resist a full-scale attack, should one ever come. And yet, that possibility seemed distant to many. Though tensions with Japan had been rising, no one could predict that in a matter of days the Pacific would erupt in flames. The men of Wake were not yet aware of the Japanese fleet bearing down on Pearl Harbor, nor of the sweeping plans to conquer islands across the Pacific in a lightning campaign of surprise and dominance. To them, Wake was simply a far-flung post, another assignment in the long chain of deployments. But beneath the apparent calm, signs of unease were growing. Officers monitored radio traffic more closely. Pilots began flying longer-range patrols. On the beaches, Marines scanned the horizon more often. There was something about the silence that felt unnatural, like a pause before a storm. Wake Island may have looked like little more than coral and scrub, but its defenders, Marine, contractor, and officer alike, were about to become legends. With outdated guns, aging planes, and an overwhelming enemy fast approaching, they would soon be called to do what few believed possible: to stand, to fight, and to hold their ground in one of the Pacific War's most stirring opening battles. The morning of December 8, 1941, dawned much like the ones before it, humid, still, and heavy with the scent of salt air and diesel fumes. Wake Island, with its palm-fringed perimeter and exposed coral reefs, lay quiet under a cloudless Pacific sky. The Marines of the 1st Defense Battalion were beginning another routine day of drills and maintenance. Civilian workers from Morrison Knudsen Company gathered around mess tents or resumed their usual construction tasks. The Wildcat pilots of VMF 211 had returned from early morning patrols, their fighters parked neatly along the narrow taxiways that ran across the lagoon-facing airstrip. It was a day like any other, until it wasn't. At approximately 7 a.m., Wake Island time, the silence was shattered by a single radio transmission. A coded message, brief and sobering, filtered in through the island's limited communications link. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. The United States was at war with the Empire of Japan. The news was jarring in its abruptness. There were no sirens or shouted announcements. No formal orders were read aloud. In fact, there was almost no reaction at all, just a slow, chilling realization spreading through the ranks and across the work crews. The Pacific, which had felt vast and distant and empty only hours before, now felt full of danger. The rumors of war that had hovered for months were no longer speculation. They had become blood-soaked fact. There were no speeches, no declarations, no grand gestures of mobilization. Just quiet nods among the officers, a few clenched jaws, hands that gripped rifles more tightly, eyes that turned skyward more often than before. The Marines tightened their defenses. The civilians dropped what they were doing and sought shelter. Orders were barked across the atoll as men scrambled to ready the island's meager arsenal. Pilots were alerted. Mechanics rushed to reposition the remaining aircraft. Machine gunners were posted at the edges of the airfield, scanning the blue void above for any sign of movement. By noon, the first wave of the Japanese assault force arrived. There had been no radar on Wake Island, no advance warning, no radar blips to track, or time to scramble a full defense. Suddenly, out of the shimmering distance, came a formation of aircraft. 18 Mitsubishi G-3M Nell bombers from bases in the Marshall Islands. They flew in disciplined rows, silver-bellied and menacing, their engines a distant thunder that grew louder with each second. As they approached from high altitude, their shadows flickered across the white sand and fractured lagoons of Wake. The defenders knew instantly what was coming. The island held its breath. Then, the sky exploded. The Japanese bombers released their payloads in tight succession. A rain of death descended on Wake Island, tearing through the airfield and surrounding areas in violent bursts. Explosions rippled across the narrow runways. The neatly arranged Wildcats, 12 of them just days into deployment, stood little chance. 8 were caught in the open, lined up along the tarmac with nowhere to hide. In a flash of fire and twisted metal, they were destroyed, engines shredded, wings torn apart, cockpits engulfed in flame. The concussions from the blasts flattened fuel tanks and set off secondary fires. Black columns of smoke rose from the airstrip, curling into the once clear sky. Barracks and maintenance sheds crumbled. The civilian workers, many of them unarmed and caught in exposed positions, ran for cover as debris and shrapnel filled the air. Several were hit. Marines rushed to aid the wounded even as more bombs fell around them. Screams mixed with the deep, pulsing roar of engines and the sharp crack of exploding ordnance. Within minutes, the well-maintained airfield had been transformed into a cratered wasteland. And yet, through the chaos, the defenders endured. Those who survived the initial strike didn't hesitate. Marines sprang into action, manning their remaining defensive positions with a grim sense of urgency. The 4 surviving Wildcats, spared only because they had been in revetments or undergoing repairs away from the main strip, were quickly relocated and camouflaged. The remaining anti-aircraft positions, though limited, were brought to full readiness. Every remaining gunner, Marine, and laborer braced for what they knew was inevitable. This was no one-time assault. It was only the beginning. The men of Wake Island, shocked, bloodied, and reduced in strength, now knew with certainty that they were alone, under siege, and very much a target. But rather than succumb to fear, they dug in. Trenches were deepened. Ammunition was stockpiled. Communications were checked and rechecked. Orders were passed quickly and without panic. The enemy had struck hard, but Wake still stood. Even in the face of overwhelming force, there was no talk of surrender. These men, whether clad in Marine fatigues or civilian work shirts, understood that they were now the first line of resistance in a Pacific war that had erupted with shocking speed. They were outnumbered, isolated, and under constant threat. But they were not broken. As dusk approached, the fires on Wake still burned. The wounded were tended to in makeshift shelters, some writhing in pain, others silent with shock. Bodies were counted. Names were called out in vain. Aircraft parts still smoldered on the airfield. The scent of gasoline and cordite hung heavy in the air. But in the hearts of those who remained, a fierce determination had taken root. They had tasted the fury of Japan's war machine and survived. They had seen comrades fall and equipment destroyed, but not their will. They understood now that their position on Wake Island was no longer just strategic. It was symbolic. They were defenders of the very first American outpost to be hit after Pearl Harbor, and the world would soon watch to see what they would do next. The Japanese would return. Everyone knew that. But next time, Wake would be ready. In the early pre-dawn darkness of December 11th, 1941, the defenders of Wake Island prepared themselves for what they suspected was coming. Tensions had been mounting since the bombing raid 3 days earlier. Though battered and still reeling from the initial Japanese air assault, the garrison had rallied with remarkable resolve. Defensive positions had been reinforced. Ammunition was rationed but ready. The 4 surviving F-4F Wildcat fighters of Marine Fighting Squadron 211, VMF 211, were serviced and concealed in camouflaged revetments, engines idling on standby. The enemy would return, but this time it wouldn't be from the sky alone. Just after midnight, a distant rumble rolled across the Pacific horizon. Lookouts spotted the faint silhouettes of approaching ships. The Japanese had returned, not just to bomb Wake again, but to take it. An amphibious invasion force, commanded by Rear Admiral Sadamichi Kajioka, was bearing down on the island. His fleet included 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, 2 troop transports carrying more than 500 soldiers of the Special Naval Landing Forces, and multiple patrol boats. It was a well-armed flotilla with overwhelming superiority on paper. The Japanese believed this would be a swift and relatively bloodless conquest. Wake Island, after all, was small, isolated, and lightly defended. Its garrison consisted of 449 Marines, a handful of sailors and radio operators, and nearly 1,200 civilian construction workers. The Japanese expected token resistance, perhaps even a white flag. No U.S. territory had ever withstood a modern amphibious invasion. Wake, they believed, would be no exception. They were wrong. As the Japanese ships moved within striking range, the defenders lay in wait. Concealed in sandbagged gun emplacements and behind hastily dug trenches, the Marines held their fire. They had orders to wait until the enemy was well within the effective range of their primary defensive weapons, 6 ancient 5-inch 51 caliber coastal guns, salvaged from World War I-era battleships. These guns had been emplaced around the island in fixed concrete positions. Despite their age, they were formidable in the hands of skilled crews. At precisely 5:30 a.m., the Japanese cruisers opened fire. Shells screamed overhead and crashed into Wake's defenses, sending columns of sand and smoke into the air. But the Marines held steady. Gun Commander Lieutenant Clarence J. Barninger and his crews waited, measured, watched. Then, as the lead Japanese destroyer, the Hayate, closed to within 4,500 yards, the order was given. Commence firing. The coastal batteries roared to life. Their thunder echoed across the lagoon and out to sea as shell after shell was hurled at the Japanese formation. Almost immediately, the gunners found their mark. A salvo slammed into the Hayate, detonating ammunition stores and tearing the destroyer apart in a flash of fire and steel. The ship erupted in a towering fireball, broke apart, and sank within minutes. Over 160 Japanese sailors went down with her. Wake Island had just claimed its first warship. The remaining Japanese vessels shifted course, returning fire and attempting to silence the shore guns. But Wake's gunners were relentless. With calm precision, they tracked targets through their rangefinders and continued pounding the enemy ships. The light cruiser Yubari and destroyer Oiti were both hit. The enemy's formations faltered. At that moment, Major Henry T. Hammerin' Hank Elrod, executive officer of VMF 211, launched into action. Elrod and a small team of Marine aviators scrambled their 4 remaining Wildcats. Though outnumbered, outgunned, and operating with minimal support, they took off into the fire-filled skies above Wake. Elrod, already known for his tenacity, led his fellow pilots in bold attack runs against the Japanese fleet. Flying low over the water, he strafed troop transports and destroyers with his 50 caliber machine guns. Then, arming 100-pound bombs slung beneath his Wildcat's wings, he went after a second Japanese destroyer, the Kisaragi. In one fateful pass, Elrod swooped down and released a bomb squarely onto the deck of the destroyer. The explosive penetrated the ship's stern and detonated near its depth charge racks. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. The charges ignited in a chain reaction, sending the Kisaragi skyward in a plume of smoke and fire. Moments later, the destroyer capsized and sank, taking her crew of over 150 men with her. In less than 30 minutes, 2 Japanese destroyers had been sunk. Hayate by coastal artillery, Kisaragi by aerial assault. The Japanese, stunned by the ferocity of the defense and the unexpected loss of their warships, began to reconsider their approach. Admiral Kajioka, watching the chaos from the bridge of the Yubari, understood that a direct landing under such firepower would result in further disaster. He ordered a full withdrawal. The transport ships turned away from the landing beaches. The battered destroyers fell back to regroup. The entire invasion fleet retreated into the open sea. Against all odds, Wake Island had held. The date, December 11, 1941, was now immortalized. It marked the only time in World War II that a Japanese amphibious landing was not just resisted, but repelled outright. On that remote coral atoll in the middle of the Pacific, fewer than 500 Marines and a handful of civilian volunteers had stared down an armada and won. The news spread quickly. In Washington, London, and across the Allied world, headlines trumpeted the Wake Island miracle. For a war effort still reeling from the attack on Pearl Harbor, the defense of Wake was a rare and desperately needed victory. It proved that the Japanese war machine was not invincible. It demonstrated that even the most isolated outpost could stand its ground when manned by the determined. But for the men on Wake, celebration was brief. They knew the Japanese would come back, this time with greater force. The victory on December 11th was inspiring, but it was only a battle, not the war. Still, in that moment, on that day, the American flag still flew high over Wake. The island, though bruised and bloodied, had not bowed. It had shown the world what courage, training, and grit could achieve, even when the odds seemed hopeless. The victory on December 11th had been historic, stunning even. It reverberated through both hemispheres. Across the United States, where the national psyche was still bruised and shaken from the humiliation at Pearl Harbor, the successful defense of Wake Island was a beacon of hope. Headlines splashed across newspapers declared the defenders the Wake Island heroes. Radio announcers' voices swelled with emotion as they described the brave Marines and civilian workers holding out against impossible odds. In a time when the Pacific seemed lost, Wake was proof that courage, training, and grit could still hold the line. But that moment of triumph was fleeting. In Tokyo, the news was received with cold fury. For the Japanese High Command, the failed invasion was more than a tactical defeat. It was a stain upon their military honor. The loss of 2 destroyers and hundreds of men, inflicted by what was supposed to be a lightly defended outpost, was unacceptable. Plans for a renewed assault were drafted immediately. This time, there would be no room for error, no mercy. Wake Island would fall, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., strategic minds within the Navy recognized both the symbolism and the strategic importance of Wake. It could serve as a forward operating base, a refueling point, and a platform for reconnaissance. But more than that, it was a chance to punch back. A relief effort was hastily organized. The aircraft carrier USS Saratoga, accompanied by the fleet oiler Neches, the seaplane tender Tangier, and several cruisers and destroyers, was ordered to sail west and relieve the embattled defenders of Wake. On board Saratoga were more than 900 reinforcements, primarily U.S. Marines, and desperately needed supplies, aircraft, and munitions. But as the Japanese geared up for a second strike, hesitation began to creep into the American response. There were concerns. Could the relief force reach Wake in time? What were the risks of a full-scale naval engagement so soon after Pearl Harbor? Reports came in that the Japanese fleet was returning, this time with overwhelming numbers. Some in command feared the loss of a carrier so early in the war. Orders began to shift. Timetables were adjusted. The urgency that had driven the original plan gave way to caution. By the time the American relief force finally got underway, it was already too late. In the dead of night, just after 2 a.m. on December 23, 1941, the horizon lit up again over Wake Island. Japanese warships had returned, this time with overwhelming force. The new invasion fleet included the heavy cruisers Tenryu and Tatsuta, additional destroyers, and 2 full infantry battalions of the elite Special Naval Landing Forces. Unlike the first attempt, this was no tentative probing action. It was an unrelenting assault designed to crush, overwhelm, and annihilate. The defenders, Just 449 U.S. Marines, around 70 Navy personnel, and over 1,000 civilian contractors, of which roughly 250 were armed and assisting in defense, knew what was coming. For days they had watched the skies, patrolled the beaches, and waited for the inevitable. Major James Devereux and Commander Winfield S. Cunningham, Wake's ranking Navy officer, had prepared every position they could. Trenches were deepened, machine gun nests reinforced, ammunition rationed down to the last clip. The Wildcat fighters were gone, either shot down or rendered inoperable. The coastal guns were damaged, their crews exhausted but still manned. At 2:35 a.m., the first shell slammed into the atoll. What followed was a ferocious naval bombardment unlike anything Wake had seen before. For over an hour, Japanese warships raked the island with fire. The entire lagoon lit up with the flash of muzzle blasts. Barrages fell on gun emplacements, dugouts, command posts, and the airfield, reducing what remained of Wake's infrastructure to rubble. The defenders clung to whatever cover they could find, heads buried in sand and arms shielding faces from splinters of coral and steel. Then came the landing. Under cover of the bombardment, Japanese landing craft swarmed toward Wake's beaches. Waves of black-painted assault boats ferried infantry ashore. At Peel and Wilkes Islands, as well as the main islet of Wake, Marines opened fire with machine guns, rifles, and grenades. Some positions were able to repel the first wave, but others were quickly overrun. The Japanese advanced with chilling discipline, using flamethrowers and grenades to clear out bunkers. Once ashore, the fighting devolved into close quarters. In the narrow alleys of sandbagged trenches, in the twisted remnants of the civilian barracks, in the shattered airstrip control building, the battle turned brutal. Marines and Japanese soldiers clashed with bayonets, entrenching tools, rifle butts, and fists. Some positions were defended until the last man fell. Major Henry Elrod, the same pilot who had sunk a destroyer, now fought as an infantryman. He was seen throwing grenades, directing fire, and personally holding the line before being killed by enemy fire. Civilians, though non-combatants, stepped into the breach. Construction workers, many of whom had never held a rifle before, carried ammunition, built barricades, and even fought beside the Marines when lines broke. Men like John Morrison, whose company had helped build Wake's airfield, became stretcher bearers, forward spotters, and in some cases, armed defenders. But by dawn, the situation was dire. Japanese troops had gained a firm foothold on all three land masses. The American defenders, outnumbered more than 4-1, were being pushed back into shrinking pockets of resistance. Communications were sporadic. Ammunition was low. Casualties mounted. At approximately 9 a.m., Major Devereux and Commander Cunningham, after conferring amidst the chaos, realized the battle was lost. Continuing to fight would mean total annihilation, not only for the Marines and sailors, but for the hundreds of civilians still trapped on the island. Reluctantly, the order was given. At 10 a.m., the white flag was raised over the main command post. Shortly after, the stars and stripes were lowered. The defenders of Wake had fought as long and as hard as they could. For 15 harrowing days, they had stood against the full might of the Japanese Empire. Their resistance had delayed Japan's Pacific timetable and inspired a nation still grappling with shock and grief. Though the island was lost, the story of Wake Island was not one of surrender, but of stubborn defiance and unbreakable spirit. Wake Island had fallen, but not without earning its place in the annals of American military legend. The cost of the battle for Wake Island was nothing short of staggering. For the Japanese, the price of conquest had been far higher than they had anticipated. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 900 Japanese soldiers and sailors were killed in the 2-week campaign, a number that includes those lost during the disastrous first assault on December 11th and the brutal land invasion on December 23rd. These losses were not just numerical. They included highly trained members of the Special Naval Landing Forces, considered Japan's equivalent of Marines, as well as 2 destroyers, Hayate and Kisaragi, sunk during the initial engagement. For a military machine used to swift victories, the delay and casualties at Wake Island were a sobering blow. The defenders, vastly outnumbered and isolated, had done the unthinkable. They had made the Imperial Japanese Navy bleed for every inch of coral sand. With fewer than 500 Marines, a scattering of Navy personnel, and a small group of hastily armed civilians, Wake's garrison had held out against air raids, naval bombardment, and full-scale amphibious assault. It was a stand reminiscent of Thermopylae, a last-ditch defense where valor, not numbers, carried the day, until overwhelming force ultimately brought it to an end. When the American flag was lowered and the white surrender flag raised on the morning of December 23rd, the island's ordeal was far from over. The surviving defenders, wounded, exhausted, and grim, were taken prisoner by the Japanese. Major James Devereux, Commander Winfield Cunningham, and the remaining Marines were loaded onto ships and transported to prisoner-of-war camps across Asia. Many ended up in brutal internment in China or Japan, where they would remain for the duration of the war. Conditions were harrowing. Disease, malnutrition, forced labor, and beatings were commonplace. Some never made it home. The civilian contractors who had built Wake Island's airfield and defenses had fared no better. Initially held as prisoners on the island itself, these men, mostly from the Morrison Knudsen construction firm, were forced to work under Japanese supervision, repairing the very structures they had once built for the Americans. They were denied adequate food and medical treatment and were subject to frequent abuse by their captors. Then, in 1943, Wake Island's darkest chapter unfolded. After a brief but intense U.S. air raid in October of that year, the Japanese garrison commander, Rear Admiral Shigematsu Sakaibara, panicked. Fearing an imminent American invasion, he ordered the mass execution of the 98 remaining American civilian prisoners still held on the island. These men were blindfolded, marched to the northern edge of the atoll, and machine-gunned. One man reportedly escaped the initial volley and carved 98 USPW-5 October 43 into a rock near the execution site before being recaptured and bayoneted. The message was later discovered, serving as a haunting reminder of their fate. This atrocity would not go unanswered. After the war, Sakaibara and his subordinate Lieutenant Commander Tachibana were tried by a U.S. military tribunal for war crimes. Sakaibara was found guilty and executed in 1947. The story of the 98 civilians became a solemn chapter in the legacy of Wake, a tale of innocence betrayed and lives stolen in the shadow of war. Wake Island remained under Japanese control for the rest of the war. It was subjected to intermittent bombing raids by American aircraft, but never saw another ground battle. Cut off from supply lines and increasingly irrelevant to Japan's shrinking empire, the garrison grew weaker and more isolated with each passing month. Finally, in September 1945, after Japan's formal surrender, American forces returned to Wake. There was no resistance. The island was retaken without a single shot fired, abandoned in spirit long before it was, in fact. Yet despite its eventual quiet recapture, Wake Island's place in history was anything but quiet. The defense of Wake became an enduring legend, a story of duty and sacrifice, of a band of Marines and civilians who stood their ground in the face of annihilation. For their valor, many received posthumous honors. Major Henry T. Elrod, the Wildcat pilot who destroyed Japanese bombers in the sky, and a destroyer at sea, was awarded the Medal of Honor for his heroism. His name, like those of so many others, lives on in the annals of Marine Corps history. For the American public, Wake Island became a symbol, a rallying cry in the early, uncertain days of World War II. The battle was covered in newspapers, radio broadcasts, and newsreels. For a nation reeling from Pearl Harbor, the defiance of Wake's defenders was a glimmer of resilience. It proved that American fighting spirit had not been extinguished. For a generation that would follow the war's every movement through newspaper clippings and radio updates, Wake Island was more than just a skirmish. It was a lighthouse in a storm. A small remote atoll became a legend, and the men who fought there etched their names into history not through victory, but through courage. The coral sands of Wake still whisper their story, of honor, of sacrifice, and of a resolve that refused to be broken, even in the face of overwhelming darkness. Epilogue. A speck of sand, a monument to courage. Today, Wake Island remains a remote military outpost. Few visit, fewer still remember. But for those who know its story, it stands as one of the Pacific's sacred battlegrounds, a coral graveyard turned monument. The Battle of Wake Island was never about winning. It was about fighting with honor. And for a brief moment in 1941, the eyes of a weary nation turned to that distant shore and saw what true valor looked like.